everybody. This is Scott Poynton with another TFT Earthworm podcast, and I'm speaking today to Professor Klaus Lackner. And Klaus is the director of the Center for Negative Carbon Emissions at the Arizona State University. And with Klaus is Bill Brandt, and Bill is the director of strategic integration at ASU Lightworks. So hello, Klaus, and hello, Bill.
Hello. Hi, how are you, Scott?
I'm good. Well, Klaus, we've introduced you as the director of the Center for Negative Carbon Emissions. This sounds pretty intriguing. Can you give us an overview of what the centre does and also your own background? I'm interested in how you've come to be in this position.
Well, by background, I'm a physicist. I spent a long time in Los Alamos and later at Columbia University as an engineer. What got me going on this particular line of research was a realization in the early 90s that the world needs energy, but with the current way of producing energy, we are going to wreak havoc. And unlike in other fields, it's actually a technology limitations. We cannot simply spread the way we produce energy worldwide and not create havoc. So we have to figure out ways of producing energy that are carbon neutral. And what I realized early on, this is a stock problem, not a flow problem. As long as we pump out CO2 into the atmosphere and dump it into the atmosphere, the CO2 levels are going up. And so sooner or later, we have to figure out how to live in a carbon neutral world. And the only real question is whether we can afford 350 ppm, which we already went through, or 450 ppm, which is most people might associated with the 2-degree warming the IPCC talks about, or maybe even a little more. But there is no option of burning all the fossil carbon which is in the world and put the CO2 in the atmosphere. So that got me going early on figuring out where do we hide all of that CO2 and then how to collect that CO2. And in the late 90s, I started to think about the fact that a large fraction of all of our emissions actually are very hard to capture because at the tailpipe of a car, it's impossible. Now you may make the car electric and get around this problem, but you won't do that to an airplane. Airplanes cannot carry the CO2 back home. Airplanes cannot run on anything but jet fuel with today's technology. So we need to figure out how to solve this problem. And in the last few years, when I came to Arizona, I also realized that we now have been talking about this problem since the 1980s and early 1990s with the Rio Agreement. We decided that we needed to do something, but we kept talking. And for all practical purposes, we have done nothing yet. And now the problem got a lot harder. And I don't think we can stop in time for 450 ppm anymore, which is the 2-degree warming line. And as a consequence, we have to be prepared to pull CO2 back out. Now, trees will do that. Agriculture can help do that. But if you ask how big you have to get to actually solve the problem, it sounds like you need machines to help. I always have the analogy that you can plow a field with a horse-drawn plow. It works just fine, but that tractor is a lot faster. So I was looking for designing the equivalent to the tractor for pulling CO2 out of the air.
And this is where you've established the Center for Negative Carbon Emissions. It's an interesting title, Negative Carbon Emissions. It's very scientific. And effectively what you're talking about is getting that carbon that's in the atmosphere out of the atmosphere into storage or into other uses. Is that right?
That's right. And I view it a little bit as a waste management problem. Right? We think of it as a pollution problem because that's how we approached it from the beginning. And we are very proud of ourselves if we can reduce emissions. But just take an analogy. If I took my garbage and dumped it in the street in front of my house, my neighbors would be very unhappy, right? And they wouldn't take it as a good answer if I said, but I worked on it very hard. I really reduced my garbage by 20% last year.
It's still on the street.
You need some way of balancing the books there, and we provide an avenue, right? Whenever you have too much, convert water into hydrogen and then use that hydrogen and CO2 to make fuels you can store. So you can balance out long-term imbalances between summer and winter. And that would allow renewable energy to penetrate far more deeply than it can without that kind of help. So we think we offer options for both sides, but ultimately we are there to close the carbon cycle and balance the budget. If you choose to pull carbon out of the ground, you must put it away.
Right.
If you think you are better off to just recycle that carbon, that is great. And come back to the garbage analogy. I recycle a lot of the stuff in my house, And the public opinion actually encourages that. But if I'm honest, I do still have some waste streams I don't know what else to do with, but to dispose of. And so here too, it is not all that easy to change things overnight.
Yeah, I mean, Bill, maybe this is a good time to bring you in. You're the Director of Strategic Integration at ASU. And I mean, you're looking at ways that we can raise the profile of the work that Klaus is doing and his team there. Give us a bit of an overview of what you're doing on this, Bill.
Sure, Scott. I think what we're trying to do is we're trying to sort of get people to sort of think about that it's more than just renewable energy. It's all about the energy system. And as Klaus pointed out, we're going to have to move to a point where we realize that what goes up does not come down unless we do something about it. So this has a business perspective as well, because what we have to do now is begin to get policymakers and companies to begin thinking about, so what is the business of generating energy? How do we use it? Then how do we do it responsibly? I think a lot of businesses would say that they do a great job of working on health, safety, and environment. They make their workplaces safe for employees. But we're now at a point where we need to begin thinking more about the system effects of what we're doing. And this is the place where I think we need, as collectively, to begin to sort of think about the overall impact on the planet that we live on, because it is kind of a spaceship. It's not unlimited, and we're going to need to sort of do a better job of managing the planet.
Indeed, we are. And this brings us to, Klaus, you're in the middle of putting together a response to an article that's appeared in Science magazine, which talks about, here we go, the moral hazard, let me just read it out there, the moral hazard and iniquity of negative carbon emissions technologies. It's entitled The Trouble with Negative Emissions. Tell us about this, Klaus. And, it just seems fascinating to me that when all the models are calling to take carbon out of the atmosphere, we're getting arguments against doing that. Just help us understand what the authors of the article are saying and why you've got a problem with it.
Well, basically the article says that if you have the option of creating negative emissions, and by the way, they're not even pushing so much on direct air capture as they are on what's called bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, then you have an excuse. The moral hazard, which actually is not the right word for it, is sort of taken from the insurance side. If I get an insurance on my car, I might park it in a place where it's risky and it might get stolen.
Because you've got insurance, you're
I got insurance,
more careless.
I have nothing at stake, right?
Yeah,
and so
right.
people say, I got insurance on the CO2 because if it gets too bad, I can pull it back out. Right? And therefore, the idea is that these kinds of technologies create complacency and will help you stop work on the problem.
Right.
I would argue there's actually no proof of that. And actually, quite the contrary, I can make the case that having these technologies will accelerate things because they force your hand now.
They force you to think about the issues, don't they?
They force you to think about the issue, and they also make it possible to solve the problem without the cooperation of the polluter. If you think about it right now, most approaches require that, right? The power plant operator will tell you it's very expensive. They don't really want to do it. And I would argue they probably can do it more cheaply than pulling the CO2 back out of the air. Mm-hmm. But if they don't cooperate, you can say, well, then that's what you will have to do. And therefore, you'd be surprised how fast they figure out how to be cheaper than we are.
Yep.
But we need to be there as an alternative. And by making the emission reversible, you can actually accelerate the process, because right now, if I emit, I say, oops, I'm sorry, now it's out there. But to stick with the garbage analogy, my neighbors can now come back and say, you're better going to sweep this up and put it away, because you can't leave it there. Right now, in the CO2 analogy, I would say, well, it's out there, and what do you want me to do? There's nothing much we can do anymore.
It's too expensive to sweep it up.
It's too expensive to sweep. It's hopeless to sweep it up.
And we all just give up, right?
And as a matter of fact, if you think about cap and trade in Europe, right, who is exempted? It's the cars, right? Because we don't really know how to deal with it. So the cap is set at power plants and other big producers, but the transportation sector got away with it because people say, well, we don't know how to do that. So if you have air capture, nobody needs to be exempted, right? So there's an example where it could get better. But I would argue the moral hazard is not right. And the unjust argument that it's a high stakes gamble and it risks people's livelihood is not right either. And the reason it's not right is that the damage is what's unjust, right? And they point that out in the article. They said if the climate runs away with us, then the people who suffer the most are the poorest. But the climate doesn't care why it ran away, whether it ran away because we couldn't figure out how to conserve enough energy or whether we didn't put in enough negative emissions. And if you take half of all of your options off the table and say you need to now fight with one hand tied behind your back, don't be surprised that the outcome is worse, right?
Yes.
So you need all options at the table. And in 1980, I would have agreed with you. Talking about this as a moral hazard makes some sense. By now, we have done all the dawdling and delaying, and we need to go as fast as we can with every option we have at our disposal.
Yeah, it seems to be, to me, a part of the precautionary principle. And beyond the precautionary principle, it's an urgent needing to address the problem. We've just popped over 400 ppm and with no real likelihood of going below that. And yes, for those people that argue we should have stayed at 350, even the discussion that we get to 450 seems a bit ridiculous. Now, here we are accelerating towards it. It seems to me, as you say, crazy to take options off the table because they might influence people to do nothing. Well, for the last 20 or 30 years, we've more or less done nothing anyway. Got to get on with this.
If you fall in the water, I'm going to throw a life preserver, right? And to try to pull you back out, right? There's no guarantee that I will succeed with doing this. But to tell you, I'm not going to throw that life preserver because with that, I take people's motivation away of learning how to swim.
Right.
It's not a good line of argument, right?
Yeah, indeed. So what do you need, Klaus? What do we need to do now? I mean, you've got your technology, you've been working on it. It's not where you need it to be able to roll it out yet. So more research required. What's the next few years hold for you, and what are you hoping for? And Bill, feel free to jump in here with the work that you're doing with ASU to try and bring partners to the table to support what Klaus is doing.
There are two things I hope to do. One is I like to hope that I like to convince people of the waste paradigm and think about it that way, because I think it will accelerate the process of success. And if that's the paradigm, we need to demonstrate that the tools to do all of that exist. And there's the garbage bin on the street corner, and there's the street sweeper. And we need all of them. We don't need just one. We need all of them. And I do believe, though, that pulling CO2 back out of the air by biological and by chemical means is critical. And the chemical means have the advantage that they can scale to arbitrarily large size. We can go to very, very large scales, and we will have to. So we need to demonstrate it, and we need to demonstrate it at a believable scale. And I think that means public demonstrations. It's good to have small companies who try to make a business out of it, and there are a few now. But they tend to be secretive, and policymakers need to be able to say, we know that it works, and therefore we can install it. And that requires sort of public-private partnerships where things can be demonstrated in the open. And unlike what has happened in the utility sector, where people talk about billions of dollars to build a single plant, I think you can do this just like solar energy and windmills at a relatively small scale. If you can demonstrate that a truck-sized device can pull a ton of CO2 back out of the air on a daily basis, you have demonstrated that it works. You then have to drive the cost down. Right? People have said, well, it's way too expensive. And of course, it's way too expensive if you start with something brand new. But if you look at photovoltaics or renewable energy in general, people have been saying for 40 years, the price is going to come down the more we do it. And on these technologies, it's the same story, except we are still tinkering on the first one. Right? We know that the science principles work, and more research is helpful, but we know that it can be done. We now have to start actually engineering devices, put them out in the open, have them done in a way that we don't have to say, well, we can't really tell you what's under the curtain because that's secret. we can have every expert in the world look at it and say, it's really working. And now then we have to figure out how to get from 1 ton a day to having many, many such devices so you can actually pull back thousands of tons, then millions of tons, and in the end, billions of tons, because that's the scale at which we emit. By the way, we do this with very tiny devices. A large fraction of what's coming out into the atmosphere comes out of individual tailpipes of small cars. There are 1 billion cars on the street and on the roads of the world. And if you were to build 100 million such units and put them up, you would actually pull all the CO2 we produce right now back out concurrently. So the scales are large, but they are not so large that you couldn't do it.
They're not so large that we're already doing things at scale in terms of emitting the rubbish. Surely we can do the same thing at scale to bring it back out of the atmosphere.
Exactly. And that is how we have to think about it. In the end, it becomes a collective action problem.
Yep.
Yeah. So Scott and Klaus, I think decarbonization becomes the lowest risk strategy to deal with the carbon problem, as we've talked about it, because we really don't have 100 years to solve this, which is kind of what you would see when you look at transitions in the industrial system. If we're talking about 30 years, then that's only about 40% of our expected life expectancies. So it's possible that we may see dramatic changes within our own lifespans, which is kind of a new thing for people living on the globe. And so from a risk management perspective, it makes just a lot of sense to be able to take the carbon out, because these systems, as Klaus pointed out, are not going to change dramatically. Think about how long carbon-emitting cars will still be on the road, even if tomorrow we could snap our fingers and go to all solar electric.
Indeed.
That's actually a very good point. If we could snap our fingers and stop everything new we do is carbon neutral, simply having the old infrastructure live out its lifetime will put us over the top.
We need dramatic action. It's clear, NGOs like Bill McKibben talks about, we've got to get on a war footing with this. I mean, we really have a major problem on our doorstep today. And I think, as you've said many times, Klaus, this is something we should have started looking at in 1980 and even before, but we haven't, and for various reasons. But here we are today. It sounds to me, Klaus, you really need partners in this, don't you? You need partners to come on board. You need the needle in the haystack, the brave people, the brave companies who are prepared to jump on board with this, with your research and your investigations, and grab some of these units, invest in the research, and take it forward. And again, not necessarily from a profit and loss perspective, but just from, in many ways, just being a good citizen. If you want to be, companies talk about being responsible and sustainable, and yet for all of their lives they've been driving carbon up into the atmosphere. Wouldn't it be a great story if some of these companies could turn around and say, well, actually, you know what? All those emissions we've been putting in place for the last X number of years up into the atmosphere, we're now working on taking them back out again. That would be pretty responsible.
That would be very responsible and would be a great thing. And from our perspective, I will do everything to help other people to get into this. My goal is not keep this in my little corner. I'm the king of negative emissions. Quite the opposite. I would like everybody to engage. And I think the more people do things, the better this will be. And if you look at technologies in general, I would argue in 50 years from now, we most likely will do air capture, but it will probably look very different than the air capture I'm suggesting right now, because technology makes progress. But it only makes progress if you have lots of players trying it.
Yeah, it's the same as you mentioned with the photovoltaics. 50 years ago, these just weren't where they are today, and they were hugely expensive. It's like mobile phones. They used to be huge bricks. Look at them now. We've got to get people working on this. You need to be able to have a vast number of scientists working on this and joining you in the hunt for the technology.
Learning by doing doesn't happen without doing.
That's right. Indeed. I think there's a lot of wisdom in what you say, Klaus, and look, I think what we've got to do is try and get your message out there to more ears, more voices talking about this, and having a discussion about it, I think, is really helpful. In fact, the paper in Science, this trouble with negative emissions, perhaps it's just what we needed. It's great that this is getting into such a high-profile science magazine. It gives you an opportunity to get your voice out there, and I think we need to do that. It might be a concerning line of argument that's being pushed, but it gives a chance to push back with more sense and more logic and some good science. So, look, I welcome the work you're doing, Klaus. I think it's fantastic, and good on you, Bill, and ASU for supporting this work. But we'll post our podcast here. We'll write some blogs, and we'll see what we can do to get some noise around what you're doing, because I think it's urgently needed, and we need more people doing it.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Scott. That's terrific.
Thanks so much for your time today, and let's keep abreast of your work, and we'll post more stories about what you're doing in the coming weeks and months and years as you go forward. Thanks so much.
Okay. Take care.
Okay.